Hi, I'm Neil Mehta, and thank you for watching this presentation on pedagogy in the age of Zoom. I'll be going over some key concepts that would apply not just to Zoom, but to any virtual platform like Microsoft Teams or Google Meet. There are so many others. And there is an assumption that you probably will be using some slides in your upcoming session. And so maybe a better title would have been Educating with a Slide Deck in a Virtual Classroom, except that it doesn't make for as good a soundbite. There are three key areas of expertise as you think about how to teach using technology. There is the content expertise, knowing how to teach, and then knowing how to use technology. And this model was described by Mishra and Kohler, and it's called the TPACK model. Now, most of you are subject matter experts in some area of medicine, and that is why you've been selected to teach seminars on that topic. And most of you have experienced, I would say all of you have experienced teaching and learning in the face-to-face space. But there are some key educational principles to keep in mind about how to teach using technology and to become comfortable with the technology itself. And this is the purpose of this presentation, is to get you comfortable in all three areas so you can do the best for our students. So a quick summary of the presentation, just to give you an idea of what is coming. Some of the key concepts that are so critical for teaching in the online and virtual classroom space. The first concept is time and attention. These are incredibly scarce resources, and we will talk about a little bit about a background on this, and then how to use the pause as a way to engage the learner and check their understanding. Then we will cover dual channel theory and the cognitive load theory, and both of these together will help you design your slides and your lesson plan and select the right resources to help you teach better. The concept of illusion of explanatory depth helps you select which are the key concepts that your students are going to struggle with. And these are the ones where you want to use the very valuable time that is face-to-face to dig deeper into to make sure they get these concepts. We'll give you a very, very quick overview of constructivism and again stress the point that it is not a passive transfer of information that you're trying to do. You're helping your learners build knowledge. And so you have to plan for the time that you are going to give the learners to do what you want them to learn. They have to do the work. And finally, we'll teach you how to put things together into a lesson plan. As I said earlier, time and attention are the two most critical resources. And we already know that time just continuously moves forward. And once it's gone, you never get it back. What I want to spend a little bit more time on is the role of attention and the fact that this is such a scarce commodity that you as an educator have to make sure that you help the student decrease the amount of distractions and focus their attention on the key learning points. And this becomes a key role of the educator. And this is even more important in the online space. The fact that our attention spans during lectures and education sessions are very brief is not a new finding. You can see right here in this study from 1978, what they did was they had 4 of the best educators give lectures on hematology, and then they asked the students to record their level of concentration. And this dark line here is the mean for all 4 lecturers. And you can see that the students' peak concentration was somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes. And right after that, the concentration starts dropping. And these findings about attention span and engagement carry forward to the current age, where this study done on MOOCs on the edX platform show that the engagement of the students peaks right around just below 10 minutes. So this is critical to know that when you are teaching on Zoom, the students' attention and engagement peaks right around 10 minutes or thereabouts. And you need to keep this in mind when you're presenting using your slide decks. If you're interested in learning more about this study, it has a lot of other very interesting implications for how we teach, and this table summarizes them. If you want to, just Google the author and the title of this study, and you should be able to find the reference, but they will be also listed at the end of this presentation. So now that we have seen that the attention span peaks right around 10 minutes or so in classroom or online settings, what can you do about it? And one suggestion is to use something called the pause technique. So what is the pause technique? So imagine that the timeline of your presentation is roughly about 60 minutes. And what you can plan for is approximately every 10 to 15 minutes, you insert a pause. And this is used to increase engagement and allow for checking of understanding. So we will take a look at the benefits of using a pause next. So here are two studies that have shown very clearly that using a pause not only improves the recall and retention of knowledge, but it also improves the faculty evaluation scores. That was a study that was on a CME activity from Mayo Clinic. And both the studies showed that students retain information better and are able to recall it better if pause is used during a teaching activity. Now that we have seen that the attention span is very short, let's also see how little bandwidth we have for attention. So one classic model of how memory works goes something like this. So we start off with sensory memory, which means, you hear something, you see something, and that is hitting our sensory receptors. And we are inundated by sensory data, but we actually don't pay attention to most of it. So when we pay attention to something, that is a piece of data is in our working memory. And as we process it, we may actually spend enough time thinking about it and working at it to push this into your long-term memory. We will see that this working memory is our key bottleneck, and we have very limited capacity to pay attention to multiple things. And you as an educator have to make sure that this learner's working memory is being used to help learn in the most effective and efficient way. So let us look at an example to help distinguish sensory memory from working memory. In this example, you will see how you can experience a lot of sensory information, but you do not actually process it till you pay attention to it. So you're going to see two versions of the same image. It's a pretty complex image with a lot of detail, and it'll flash between version A and version B very, very quickly. And your goal is to try and find the difference between the two versions. And I'll give you a little bit of time to try and identify it, and then try and draw your attention to the area where there is a difference. And then we will try and see why this difference actually happens. So here we go. So you should now see two versions of an image and try and spot the difference between the two versions. And I'll let it flash 5 more times, and then I will start narrowing the area where you can focus to find the difference. So the difference is in this rectangle over here. And now I'll show you where the difference is. And most of you should now be able to spot the difference. So what actually happened there? What happened is that the entire image was hitting your retina and reaching your occipital cortex. That is the sensory memory. But you could not compare the two versions of the image because it was actually, you were seeing the second version of the image before you could process the first version. And because you were not able to get it in your working memory, because you were not paying attention to the area where the circle is right now, you could not compare the two versions of the image. So your goal as an educator is not to try and give every piece of information that you know to a student, but point them to the most significant areas and help focus their attention on these key concepts. We just saw that our working memory has very limited bandwidth. There is good news though. It actually has two channels, and this is a theory proposed by Pavio, and it's called the dual coding theory or the dual channel theory. And we have the verbal channel and we have the visual or the symbolic channel. And so if you think about it, if I just say the word tree, and I'm actually just saying it, that is the auditory channel, and it is basically a part of the verbal channel. On the other hand, if I actually presented to you an image of the tree, in your mind it means the same thing, and that is the symbolic or the visual channel. The good news, like I said, is these two channels are complementary, and by using these two channels together, you can increase the understanding and increase the recall of information. But if, on the other hand, you write the word tree, what it does is to interpret the word, you have to see it and see each letter. And then to understand the word, you actually have to use your verbal channel. And this, unfortunately, when you use words that are written and spoken together or written and drawn together, can actually make the task of understanding more difficult by increasing the cognitive load. And this is something that is very important in how you present data and how you present your slides. And we shall see that in the next few slides. Now that you have reviewed the concepts of cognitive load and dual coding theory, you can recognize why this slide is bad. Imagine a professor teaching lipid transport, and they cram everything they can into this one slide. And they have a ton of text that is present here. And in addition to that, they have an image which is also incredibly dense, all on the same slide. And as you have seen from the dual coding theory, this is saturating both the verbal and the visual channels. And this saturates the visual channel just because of how much data is there. And now imagine that this professor also starts reading off of the slides. And so in addition to this, it would also saturate the audio. So you basically have very high amounts of data in the verbal channel and very high amounts of data in the visual channel. And the student's attention is going to be completely overloaded. So what you need to do as you design the slides is to keep these two concepts in mind, cognitive load and the dual coding theory. And that'll help you increase the efficiency with which your learners can learn. It is important to think about cognitive load and classify it in three ways. Firstly, there is extraneous cognitive load. This is unnecessary cognitive load. Imagine that you are that professor teaching lipid transport, and you ask a student to read a paper before the session. But the paper is behind a paywall, and the student has to create an account create a password and log in just to download the paper. This does not help in any way with their learning, and this is something that you could reduce by making it easier to read the paper as fast as possible. Then there is the intrinsic load, and this comes from the concept itself being complex. Imagine lipid transport and trying to explain the ApoB and how it helps transport lipids and the VLDL and how it converts to LDL. That is complex by itself. What you can do is try and make this as easy to understand as possible, but the concepts are complex. And then there is the germane load, and this is a load that you actually want to create. And what we mean by germane load is trying to make the concepts more relevant. So you could imagine having a case of a patient who's got a heart attack and explaining how this is related to a plaque in the coronary artery and a rupture of the plaque and the subsequent thrombus that forms, and how the lipids play a role in formation of that plaque. And this would help actually make the intrinsic part of the concept more important, relevant, and more likely that the student will pay attention to them. So Richard Mayer presented the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, and he combined some of the concepts that we have already looked at, the cognitive load and the dual coding theory, and helped put together a theory that helped educators know best how to teach using technology and multimedia. So there are 5 key parts of this theory, or 5 key principles, and we are going to look at just 3 of them. So the first principle is multiple representation, second is contiguity, and the third is split attention. And we'll look at these 3 in the subsequent slides. There are 2 more principles that we will not go into detail here, and I'll just talk a little bit about them right now. So the individual differences means that depending on the level at which a learner is, some of these principles may not apply. A very advanced learner would be able to learn in spite of problems with the slide or the problems with the way information is presented. And coherence is basically a principle that if you can create a very short summary of what a learner is going to learn and what you have covered, it really helps a learner digest the information. So lumping 2 of these principles together, the principle of multiple representation means that learners learn better when you present information using both the channels, both the verbal and the visual channel. And the split attention principle says that if you present information as written text, it uses up both the verbal and the visual channels, and so it is better to speak the words rather than present them as text on the screen. So, for example, we could show a tree and say the word tree, and that is much better than actually writing the word tree on the screen like this, because when you say something and show an image, the 2 channels are used in a complementary way as opposed to in an inefficient way. The third principle, which is the contiguity principle, says that related pieces of information should be presented close to each other, and that way the learner can pay attention to both of them at the same time. So let's take an example of what this would look like. Taking this image of the model that you should now remember, which is the sensory, the working, and the long-term memory. And what the image here has done is put in numbers and then the labels and the key. And to understand this image, the learner has to constantly look from the top to the bottom and it increases cognitive load, and it does not serve the purpose of learning. But you could very easily do something slightly different without too much more effort. And you can see immediately that this information is much easier to digest. Now, what you could do in addition is to present the information in a way that the learner knows when you're talking what to focus on. And so you could build this slide by first presenting just the incoming information, then pointing out the sensory information, so the learner is not struggling to understand what to focus on. The cognitive load is reduced and it helps them learn better. So let us look at some take-home points from what we have discussed so far. One, when you make your slides, try and keep the information on the slide visual, and instead of text, make sure that you are speaking rather than having a lot of printed words on the slide. Secondly, guide the learner to the part of the slide so it helps them focus, and so they use their attention in an effective way, as we saw from the experiment with the flashing two versions of the slide. Thirdly, if you have complex diagrams with labels, make sure the text of the labels is very close to and is presented at the same time as you're presenting that part of the image or the diagram. And finally, try and keep each slide limited to very few concepts, maybe even just one concept per slide. Slides are free. You can add more slides rather than cram a whole bunch of information into one slide. Having looked at the concepts of time and attention and dual coding theory and cognitive load, let us now move on to the concept of illusion of explanatory depth. And this was first described by Rosenblit and Kyle. And Rebecca Lawson did an amazing study and named it The Science of Psychology to highlight how we often think we know something. These are things that are pretty common, and we may actually not know it. And we will next take a look at an example to understand this better before seeing how this applies to your teaching. So let us take a look at the experiment that was done by Rebecca Lawson in psychology. So if you want to play along, it'd actually be fun and pretty instructive. You can pause this video and go and get a piece of paper and a pencil, and then once you're ready, hit continue and play along. So if I asked you, how good is your understanding of a bicycle? Just put a number down on the piece of paper, 10 being you really know how a bicycle works, to 0 being you have no clue. And just put that on a piece of paper, and now let's start. So imagine that I gave you this image of a bicycle. Take a second to draw something like this by looking at the screen on your piece of paper. And now you have to complete the image using just 3 more elements. First, you can use a solid line to draw the rest of the frame. Use this S-shaped icon to indicate the pedals, and use the dotted line to indicate where the chain would be. And this, you can pause the video again and take maybe 10-15 seconds and complete this image. So hopefully you played along and you now have an image of the bicycle that was created using the 3 elements that you saw on the previous screen. And what Dr. Lawson found was 50% of students at premier engineering colleges actually struggled to create the image of the bicycle accurately. And what does this mean? What this means is that common everyday things in our lives that we assume people know and we assume we know, we actually don't have a deeper understanding of. And as a content expert, a subject matter expert, hopefully you can take a little bit of time to reflect on the presentation you're going to give to the students and identify 2 or 3 key areas that probably a number of students will misunderstand or think they know and they don't know or find very hard to grasp. And this exercise helps you identify what to really use the most precious time you got, which is the face-to-face time or the Zoom time that you have with the students to help clarify these misunderstandings. And that is how you will start creating a lesson plan by focusing on what to do during the actual Zoom session. So let us take a look at an example of how being able to think about the illusion of explanatory depth or focusing on concepts that are difficult to understand or misunderstood helps you design your Zoom session. So imagine that for some reason your session is about hypoxemia and you're teaching in basic sciences, so you're probably explaining the physiology and the pathophysiology of how hypoxemia occurs. Now you could very well have a lesson plan where you're going to go over the 5 causes of hypoxemia, give examples of each, maybe have some diagrams, some animations to explain why each one happens. And that takes up your 60 minutes. Now, I don't normally teach this topic, but my guess is that if most students are, at the same level, there are some of these concepts that are very easy to grasp. I think for people to understand that if there is less oxygen in the air they breathe in, there will be less oxygen in the blood is probably so obvious you don't need much time to explain that. Or that if you are not breathing or breathing very, very shallow and slow, you will not get much oxygen into the lungs, and so not much oxygen into the blood, and that is also pretty easy to understand. Or if you have problems with the lungs, so the air or the oxygen from the alveoli cannot go into the capillaries, that's also pretty easy to understand. So already within a second of writing these 5 learning objectives, you know that 3 of them don't need much time to explain. The right to left shunt maybe a little bit more, but again, it's not as complicated. And maybe the VQ mismatch may be the hardest to understand or is often misunderstood. So what do you do with this information? What you can do, and I'm not saying this is the only way to do it or you have to do this, this is just an illustrative example. You could give them a video, and there are thousands of videos on YouTube and elsewhere. Find the one that is the most accurate and understandable and just share it with them, or share with them a chapter of a physiology book and have them read it ahead of time. And what will happen is they will grasp these 3 concepts very quickly, and some of them will get these also. But then what do you do in class? And what you can do in the class is go back and review these 5 just to make sure that everyone is on the same page. But then have an activity, maybe during your pause, where you make the students think about applying what they have learned from reading the paper to a question, and ask them a question which could be something like this. And the general assumption that most students have, or at an early stage, is the PE causes hypoxemia because it blocks the pulmonary artery. And when you pose this question, hopefully they will stop to think about this and say, well, that actually should not cause hypoxemia because it's just blocking the deoxygenated blood and all the lungs are getting aerated. And hopefully you can spend enough time on this question that they actually understand the role of VQ mismatch and why it happens in pulmonary embolism. And they will get a much deeper understanding of hypoxemia. And in addition, you will clear up something that often many physicians have never thought about as to why a PE causes hypoxemia. Similar to the hypoxemia example, you can think of many, many examples in your area of expertise. That is why you are a content expert. I just chose a few more to highlight that this is something you can do in almost any of the organ system courses. Some of these are taken from the Twitter feed of Tony Bro, his educator, medical school educator in Boston. So suppose you want to teach infectious disease, you could have them read a paper on bacteria and mechanisms of resistance, but then ask them why group A strep almost never develop penicillin resistance while strep pneumonia does or Staph aureus does. You could talk about in rheumatology why giant cell arteritis predominantly affects temporal arteries, even though there are very many similar sized vessels elsewhere in the body. Or in hematology oncology, you can ask them to think about why really cancer is a hypercoagulable state and get into the details of the coagulation cascade and which part of it is affected by having cancer. So what we just covered is that time that you have face-to-face with a large number of students is incredibly precious. And instead of covering everything possible about a topic, it's possible and probably more efficient to give them a resource that makes them quickly get the key concepts, but recognize the concepts that will be misunderstood or not understood, or people may think they got it, but they actually did not. And hopefully these concepts are so fundamental that they will stand the test of time. So you spend time thinking about how HMG-CoA reductase is related to lipid metabolism. And you spend time on that, it'll help the students understand statins, but down the road when the PCSK9 inhibitors come around, it'll help them understand those. So that becomes a fundamental concept that is worth spending time on. So think about these types of concepts in the topics that you want to cover, and those are the ones you want to spend extra time on and focus on during the face-to-face or Zoom sessions. So now that we have covered the illusion of explanatory depth, let's go back to something very, very basic in education, which is constructivism. And let us start with a favorite comic strip, the Calvin and Hobbes. And here is Calvin talking to Hobbes and describing that something weird is going to happen. So in front of them is a piece of bread and a box, which is a toaster. So Calvin goes, watch, you put bread in this slot and push down this lever. And then in a few minutes, toast pops up. Well, so far so good. What's the big deal? Well, Hobbes and Calvin are looking into the box to say, where does the bread go? And Calvin goes, beats me. Isn't that weird? So what do we learn from this? We learned that people have schemas in their brain, mental representations of their knowledge. And here, both of them think of bread as a slice of white material, and the box, they're really not sure what it does, except it creates toast. But the part that they did not know is it's the same piece of bread that you put in that comes out as toast. And when you heat up a piece of bread, it turns brown and is now called a toast. And the toaster is something that heats the bread. Now, after this experience, if they asked the right questions or reflected or discussed or talked to educator, someone would help them understand these concepts and they would have learned something new. And the point is that people construct knowledge from their experiences, and this comic strip example just tries to highlight that. So constructivism basically means that we do not passively transfer information from our brains to those of our learners. We are all active creators of our own knowledge. And when we experience something and we discuss or reflect on it, we build new knowledge, and learners will create the meaning from what they do to learn. So it's not just sitting there, but actually doing something actively and creating meaning from that is what helps us learn. And that is what educators need to keep in mind about the concepts we want our students to learn. Having seen how constructivism works, let us see how that will help us create a lesson plan. And a model that I often use for this is called the Bigg's constructive alignment. So Bigg states that 4 things need to come into alignment to create a learning experience so that a student who goes through that experience is almost always going to learn what you are planning. So how do you do that? So you start by thinking about the broad desired outcomes. Think about, I want a student to learn about lipids and plaques and coronary artery disease and MI. Okay, narrow it down to a very specific intended learning objective, something that you could measure. For example, a student will be able to summarize or describe or draw a diagram of how ApoB transports lipids. Something that you can actually see that a student has learned. Once you've figured out what your objective is, think about how you would assess that. So you could actually make a student draw a diagram of ApoB and it carrying triglycerides and cholesterol and going from VLDL to LDL. And finally, once you've done that, what you want to do is think about your educational strategy, which becomes your lesson plan. And this is where you could say, well, there are some concepts about lipids that are pretty basic that I would ask them to pre-read. And then during the actual session on Zoom, you could pose a question that would help them really clarify any misunderstandings and understand this at a deeper level and help you get to the learning objective that you are seeking. So far, we have looked at time and attention, dual coding theory, cognitive load, and cognitive load in the setting of multimedia and technology. Then we looked at the illusion of explanatory depth and the fact that we construct knowledge, we don't passively transfer it. How do you put all of this together into a lesson plan? So this slide here is the summary of everything we have covered and will look pretty busy by the time we are done. But I wanted to put it all in one place so you have a big picture of what we have gone through in this presentation so far. So as you go through this, think about the presentation or the session you're going to give and try and apply this lesson plan to that. So first of all, think about the very big picture concept that you want the students to have. You know, we talked about lipids and coronary artery disease and plaques. Next, what you want to do is think about what the students might already know about it, because they construct knowledge on top of what they already know. So you want to leverage what they already know instead of going over it again. Then narrow down the big concept to very specific learning objectives that you could actually measure that the students were able to get. This would include not just the things that would be covered during the Zoom session, but also what would be covered during pre or post work. Next, looking at the illusion of explanatory depth, think about the 2 or 3 concepts that are the hardest for people to pick up. These could be knowledge or skill or attitudes, behavior, whatever. And these are the ones you're going to spend more time on during the Zoom session. This will also need the most effort from the learners because learners learn from doing and not from just listening. There are other things which could be somewhat easy to pick up or things that they already know somewhat, and you could put that as pre-work and help get everyone on the same page. As you do that, keep in mind the extraneous cognitive load and make sure these are easy to find and don't make them waste time finding the resources. Make sure you curate the resources, or if none are available, you may have to create some content, a little bit like what I'm doing right now for our session on faculty development for Zoom. Then you are ready to design the plan for your Zoom session. So what do you do for that? First of all, think about having some germane cognitive load. This is the content that helps make your intrinsic content more relevant. In medicine, having a case or a story really helps a lot. So we talked about how you would have a case of a patient with an MI and gets a cardiac cath and shows a blockage, which is a fresh thrombus. And you could then move on to where the thrombus came from and the role of the ruptured plaque. Make sure when you start, you do discuss some of the pre-work to ensure that everyone did cover it and clear up any questions about it. As you design your slides, use the dual coding or the dual channel theory and leverage the visual and the verbal channels, but avoid too much text. Again, if people have already reviewed everything, then summarizing the content at the end so that it's all in one place actually helps learning, which is kind of what we are doing. And that is the coherence principle of cognitive learning multimedia theory. Use pause. So every 10 to 15 minutes, pause. And this would be the times where ideally you would pose the questions that you created based on the concepts that are hardest to understand, often misunderstood, and are the most fundamental. Do not try and cram too much into the session. You have to give learners time to do the work to learn. And at the end, it's very helpful to leave 5 minutes for the students to reflect and even summarize what they took away from the session. You could ask the student to volunteer to speak up about 1 or 2 things that they took away. At this point, you could always leave them with references, more detailed work, and if you did your job right, you lit the spark and they will want to learn more and they will do it on their own. Don't try and cram that into the session.